your reason for going into government, your reason for signing up to all the things that you signed up for is because of the urgency of the climate crisis, but yet you are continuing to sit in a government which is failing. Every report that we get says that we're failing. Just to start with the EPA report, and in terms of the EU targets, which are obviously relative to 2005 rather than our 2018 targets, they're saying, the EPA is saying that with the existing measures will achieve a reduction of 9% by 2030, and with additional measures would be at 25%, down from 30% that they estimated last year. Could you tell me what is the range of fines that we are looking at? If, for example, we only have existing measures, we're at 9%, what fines are we looking at? If we hit 25% reductions, what fines would we be looking at?
The EPA, you're right, there are different baselines and different targets. But the EPA, one of the targets they have is emissions reduction 42% by 2030, and that's broken down obviously into two compliance periods between 2021 and 2025, and then 26 to 2030. The EPA are predicting in the first period we will have a 0.06 megaton gap. Very small, in truth. The cost of that would, and to a certain extent, the cost obviously depends on how many other parties have a surplus that you'd have to negotiate any agreement with. But I don't expect there to be a significant compliance cost in the first period. The second period, the 2026 to 2030, that we have to focus on, they're looking at a compliance gap of 17.59 megatons. The exact cost, the Department of Finance are doing some assessment at the moment of what the potential costs might be. They're very significant, but it's impossible to put a figure on it because it does depend, as I say, on how other countries, how many people in are in a sense have a surplus that they'd be able to meet and to trade. But it is not insignificant. It would run into my mind several billions, and that is far better for us to spend that money here in making the emissions reductions and closing the gap, which I believe we can do. But it requires huge political effort, and it's not too late. The second period does depend on what we do over the next 2 to 3 years.
I mean, I agree with that, but you're in a government that is putting money away in a rainy day fund as opposed to actually investing it to do it now, which doesn't even make sense from a point of view of the economics of it. Forget about the need to have a livable future for humanity. Putting money away now, not spending it, and as a consequence being hit with fines that run into the billions of euros doesn't make sense, but that is what the government is currently doing. Yeah,
but the government also set up the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. I don't think there's another European government or government globally which has set aside some of what is in effect a sovereign wealth fund specifically earmarked for investment in climate and nature. And that was very scientifically done in terms of, we took some of the work in the task forces in terms of what do we need to do in public buildings, what do we need to do in district heating, what do we need to do in anaerobic digestion. Some of the capital grants for anaerobic digestion will come from the Climate and Nature Fund, where we have put money aside for that very purpose.
But, I mean, with additional measures, that's with the stuff that's been promised that we're planning to spend the money on. At the moment, the money is not being planned to be spent.
But as the CEO of Laura Burke, I think, said in the morning on this morning, they're closing the gap will include measures such as those anaerobic digesters that weren't within existing modelling systems.
But the EPA report is telling us that with everything that the government is planning to do, with all the additional measures, we're still going to be miles off where we need to legally be in terms of Irish targets, where we need to be in terms of EU targets, and even actually further away in terms of where we should be in terms of the science. That's the bottom line, which I think is a damning indictment of the government, but not just the government, of the Green Party in particular, which your reason for going into government, your reason for signing up to all the things that you signed up for is because of the urgency of the climate crisis, but yet you are continuing to sit in a government which is failing. Every report that we get says that we're failing.
We're succeeding in a whole variety of different areas, in renovating our homes, in delivering renewable power. But could I put back to the other way? The areas we have a challenge delivering up the scale of renewables, Your own party colleagues in Dunleary are opposed to the development of offshore wind, which is going to be one of the ways that we do close the gap. Your own colleagues in Dunleary fought tooth and nail against some of the traffic calming measures, the Pathfinders project, that would not only reduce emissions but also improve the local environment. And that is the challenge, getting political agreement on some of the difficult changes you need to make. Do you support the development of offshore wind in the East Coast? Why did you oppose the Pathfinder project in Dunleary? Because they're some of the measures that can help close the gap.
I mean, if you want on that, because you raised that point about the Dunleary, the Living Streets, whatever the project was in Dunleary. You raised that with me in the Dáil before, and I went to check it, and then I checked, and our councillor, we've one councillor in Dunleary, they voted in favour of that project. In terms of the offshore wind, again, we're in favour of the development of offshore wind, but there are, in that case, there is real biodiversity issues. We have a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. There isn't just one planetary limit, there's 7 at least. And so we can't cross all of these, and like in doing one thing, we need to not cause other ecological crises. So I don't, let me put it back to you. I note and I welcome the fact that your MEP candidates are running for the European Parliament on a platform, amongst other things, of banning private jets. Obviously, actually, private jet emissions will not have an impact here, but they clearly have an impact on our globe. We have a private members bill, which has gone past first stage, which we're going to introduce at second stage, to do precisely that, to ban private jets. Will you and your Green Party colleagues be voting in favour of that bill to actually ban private jets?
I haven't seen the bill, and we'd have to look at the legality of it. Can we do it under the Chicago Convention, which may present real difficulties, but it won't, as I said, do anything to close the gap that we're discussing here today that we do need to close. And can I go back to that point you made earlier? There are trade-offs. It is difficult. Sometimes you have to make decisions, and it won't just be Dublin, it'll be the Wicklow coast as well. Some of these hard calls are going to need to be made, where there will be some impact on biodiversity from some of the renewable power systems that we have to develop, but we do need to make those calls. And I think part of our biggest problem has been public opposition or lack of political support for some of the difficult changes, particularly in transport, particularly in land use and agriculture. It is all difficult. But our party in government, I'm very proud that we went into government to effect change and to deliver real long-term change, which sometimes takes time. We will see the benefits from the decisions we're making in government in the next decade and in the one beyond that. And I see the key question is, do we stop and start? Does the next government continue to take the course we're taking? Because if we do, I believe we can make our meet our targets. Really challenging. Maybe arrive a year later, the exact year of delivery. But it actually requires consistent, brave decision making, which is what we have provided in government.
No, anything but brave decision making. The children will pay the price for the lack of action by this government. That's the truth. And you can try and lull people to sleep and pretend that everything's going to be okay. It's not. We're heading towards an absolute catastrophe, and you are not telling the truth to people. The EPA report tells the truth to people. And let me get to a question. The private jets issue, actually, it reveals the whole thing. Right, private jets are enormously polluting. You understand it. They're 16 times or so more polluting than travels by commercial flights. The vast majority of people on this planet will never be on a private jet in their life. It's a tiny, tiny minority of people. But what you just said, you're running for election. Your candidates are campaigning on the basis of campaigning for banning private jets. But when it comes to a vote in the Dáil on banning private jets, you won't commit to actually do it. So false promises when you're in opposition, and then when you're in government, you just give up most of them.
We could trade party political attacks here in terms of, I remember your own party being champions of the expansion of the oil and gas exploration, believing that was the future of the country, where I saw your posters. We will have billions.
Nonsense. Nonsense. I was there. You stood with the Rossport 5 and then you sold them out when you were in government. That's what that's about.
I was here in the Dáil.
I was battened off the streets by the Gardaí because of standing up for the...
I was here in the Dáil when you made that very case that our future rested with fossil fuel expansion. At a time for the last 3 decades, our party has been unique and singular in actually calling out the climate crisis for what it is. No. It is a threat to our children's future.
We're going to move on.
It is something where we do have to make fundamental changes for the better.
The question about private jets.
We all agree it's a threat to our future. We're going to move